All right. Hello, everybody. We're going to get started in just a moment. Welcome to this webinar on the report of the Cross-Institutional Task Force on Gender Diversity and Arbitral Appointments. Just before we do get started, I wanted to run over just a few quick ground rules. We have a couple hundred people on the line today, so you'll notice that we have muted all the participants. Please do keep your microphone on mute. We do invite questions throughout the event. We have a chat box, which you'll see on the lower right-hand side of your screen. In that box, you can send a question or a comment directly to me, Damon, as a host, or to the panelists. We'll be collecting those as they come. We will go through all the presentations first, and then take some time at the end of the webinar to address the questions we've received. If you do have any questions at any point, please do send me a message in the chat box. With that, I will hand it over to Carolyn to introduce our speakers, our program, and our first presentation.
So thank you very much. And most of all, thank you to the extraordinary group of institutions, organizations, lawyers, arbitrators, advocates, all parts of the international arbitral community that came together to produce this report. You can see the primary participants listed here on slide 2. And not only was it these 17 who contributed greatly the data that we relied on to do the analysis, but we also surveyed over 30 women arbitrators, and to really assess how did they get there? How did they get to where they are? And most of the really predominant women in the field responded, and we integrated that into our analysis. Of course, we're all committed to diversity and inclusion, and to the analysis of data to look at where we are. But the other very important part of this report is we wanted to provide a roadmap going forward. It's not just enough to condemn the statistics. We really have to inspire a change in our world that will improve us, all of us, in what we do and how we handle disputes. You will hear about the extraordinary nature of our report today from Nicola Pert, who was so important to the production and really will present the empirical study, as she should, on the main data and findings of the report. She's the one that did the heavy lifting together with several others from Wright and Case, Jen Ivers, etc., who supported her. Also, Lucy Greenwood, an independent arbitrator. She'll talk about our leaky pipeline, but also positively a path forward. Tom Sikora presents a very important part, the client's perspective on gender diversity. And it's not to be minimized what a very difficult choice it can be when choosing your arbitrator and the kinds of background you're looking for to prefer one over another on the basis of race or gender. But he's done it, and I think will present very well the difficulties. Klaus van Wobesser, who will talk about the vital role of co-arbitrators in so many international arbitrations. It is very important for the co-arbitrators to nominate the president to come together. And you will see from the data, that's not one of the areas where we've excelled as a community. And Klaus is going to discuss that today. And finally, our star, who's made incredible inroads in the area, the role of institutions, by Meg Kinnear, who's the Secretary General at ICCID, and she will talk about the ICCID example. I think we can go to slide 6 on why we created the task force. All of us, from our participation in international arbitration, are well familiar with anecdotal evidence, with our own impressions about progress or the lack thereof, and our own impressions about how to fix it. We really feel that inclusion is needed from a legal perspective, from a policy perspective, to preserve the legitimacy of the arbitral process and really to enhance it. And one observes the ongoing efforts of Arbitral Women, of the Pledge, of other committed organizations. And we wanted to bring together, really for the very first time, all of the key actors and to assess the current state and to propose steps forward. Why did we focus on gender? That at the beginning, of course, the ICCA committee is composed and looks at all parts of inclusion and policy. And ICCA did initiate a diversity and inclusion policy that covers all diversity. When we looked at the data and the way we could report the various segments of the lawyer population, of the arbitrator population, are at very different stages of advancement and would need a lot more focus depending on what you were analyzing. And most of the institutions simply didn't report statistics on all of the diverse populations. They report statistics, many of them on gender, and do not report in other areas. ICCA will continue to work in the other areas. The Diversity and Inclusion Task Force, headed by Vera Van Hoot, it has a whole separate segment that will focus on race and ethnicity. So what did we find? And this is very general. You can look at the trend line with the historic progression of female appointments across institutions for the past 20 years. And I think the very positive thing that this shows, you can see a dramatic increase starting in about 2005. And I think that's when Arbitral Women began. Within several years thereafter, we had the Pledge, and focusing on the need for improvement has had a dramatic effect. When we analyze the data, and Nicola will go into this in far more detail, look at slide 9, in terms of the women as a percentage of arbitrators appointed in the various institutions, you can see the institutions, in fact, committed to and made a lot of the change, because in their appointments, they in fact did turn to women. And you'll see that party appointments lags a bit, and so do the co-arbitrators. So that's where we need to inspire more. There's no denial that this is tremendously important. If we look at slide 10, you'll see the various reasons that diversity is very important in international arbitration in the report in part 2. Clearly, we think the law demands it. Some of the new investment treaties are requiring a balance. And, one of the interesting things is that by doing that, certainly in Europe, the boards of corporations have to contain a certain percentage of women, and they all continued and excelled. So I don't think by having those kinds of requirements, we would at all impair, we would only enhance the arbitral process. In terms of the diversity campaigns, if we look at slide 11, arbitral women have been very important. The arbitration pledge has been very important. And you can see the impact on the data if we go to the next slide very quickly. It went in 2015 from 12% of the appointments to 2019, 21%. That doesn't happen without a focus and a commitment. And to make change, I think we all have to acknowledge it's not like turning on a light switch. It takes a sustained effort and commitment at the institutional level by parties and by co-arbitrators. We've identified on slide 13 a number of reasons for the lack of gender diversity, and they're identified in the report in part 2. And, I think number 1 we can deal with, that it's low on the list of priorities, and the rest boil down many to experience an unconscious bias. So there are ways to address all of these things. If you look at section 3 of the report, we have a number of recommendations, both to train and give experience to and promote women in their appointments. In part 3 of the report, we have recommendations for young practitioners. That's on slide 15, so that we are building the kinds of qualities and experience in younger women on our teams so that they can emerge to take over and begin smaller appointments and then bigger appointments. And I think that's what's tremendously important in this report, not only the data and the analysis of the data, but looking at part 2 and part 3 and 4 on the roadmap forward. So I now leave it to Nicola to talk about the empirical analysis of the data.
Thank you, Carolyn, and thank you also to Meg and to ICSID for co-hosting this event with ICCA. It's a pleasure to be speaking on this panel. A key objective of the task force, as Carolyn just mentioned, is to publish much-needed statistics on the appointment of female arbitrators. I will give a brief overview of the main findings of the report, which include the extent to which institutions, co-arbitrators, and parties are appointing female arbitrators. And my objective is to provide further context for the discussions that follow on this panel. First, a brief word about the source of our data. The primary source is the task force members. That includes 8 leading arbitral institutions listed on this slide. For 2 institutions that appear in this presentation, the Permanent Court of Arbitration, the Court of Arbitration for Sport, the task force gathered data based on publicly available information about their cases. And this means that the CAS and the PCA statistics in this presentation do not include purely private cases that have not been reported. And all of the data gathered by the task force, I should add, is published in the appendices to the report, and those are available for others to analyze in more detail. I put 2 web links there on the slide. It's the ICCA website and the CLUA website. One of the headline findings of the report is that since 2015, the proportion of female arbitrators has, on average, almost doubled. Carolyn mentioned these statistics in her presentation, and you see there on the slide, the red dashed line is the average. In 2015, the average was around 12%. 2019, that was 21%. One of the questions that we've had from our audience already is, does this total reflect co-arbitrators or chairs? In fact, the total is both co-arbitrators, chairs, sole arbitrators. There hasn't been a distinction between the role of the female arbitrator in this particular slide. Although, as I'll come on to, when we look at co-arbitrators, you are there looking at the position of a chair. This trend of increasing gender diversity is reflected in the caseload of individual institutions, and indeed all 10 of the institutions reflected on this chart observed a positive increase in the proportion of female arbitrators between 2015 and 2019. For example, and I've put two illustrations on the slide, the ICDR and ICSID. You'll see the proportion of arbitrators in ICSID-administered cases, represented by the darker green line, increased from roughly 11% in 2015 to 19% in 2019. This overall average trend is very positive, very encouraging. However, given that on average, only around a fifth of new arbitrators in 2019 were female, there is some room for improvement. To identify opportunities for increasing gender diversity, the task force assessed the extent to which co-arbitrators, institutions, and parties were appointing female arbitrators, and I'll turn to that next. First, institutional appointments. Over the past 5 years, approximately a third of institutional appointments have been female. As the red dashed line indicates, in 2015, the average proportion of institutional appointments that were female was 32.5%, while in 2019, that figure was 34%. Not a huge amount of difference. However, there is some variability in the data, particularly in 2015 and 2016, which masks some notable developments. Aside from the Vienna International Arbitration Center, which you can see indicated by that light blue line above the average, aside from that line, other institutions recorded a significant increase in the diversity of institutional appointments. For example, the London Court of International Arbitration, represented by the yellow line, ICSID in green, and the Hong Kong International Arbitration Center in the dark red line, all saw an increase in the proportion of female arbitrators by at least 20% over the recorded period. For the HKIAC, the percentage of female institutional appointees nearly tripled in just 3 years, from around 7% in 2016 to 25% in 2019. And these trends suggest that institutional commitments, some of which Carolyn referred to diversify arbitral tribunals, are indeed translating into positive results. Turning next to co-arbitrator appointments. This chart shows that co-arbitrator appointments of female candidates have, on average, again, more than doubled over the past 4 years in percentage terms. In 2015, the average proportion of female co-arbitrator appointees was just under 10%, and that figure more than doubled by 2019 to over 21%. One important feature of this data is that there is significant variability over the years for certain institutions, like the Stockholm Chamber of Commerce, which you see represented by that dark blue line. For these institutions, we have very small data sets, and this means that a change in the actual number of female appointments a small change in the actual number of female appointments results in a significant change in the percentage of those female appointments. But for institutions with larger data sets, the overall trend is less noisy. Again, two illustrations. For the ICC, represented with the light blue line, you see that in 2015, the proportion of female co-arbitrator appointments was just over 6%. By 2019, 20%. Similarly, for the London Court of International Arbitration, the LCIA, represented by the yellow line, the proportion of female co-arbitrator appointments in 2015 was 4%. By 2019, 30%. This again indicates a positive upward trend in the diversity of co-arbitrator appointments. Turning now to party appointments. As the red dashed line indicates, the proportion of female party-appointed arbitrators has also increased over the last 4 years. On average, in 2015, 8.5% of party appointments were female. By 2019, that figure had risen to roughly 14%. At an institutional level, there is quite a bit of variation, however. I've put 3 illustrative examples on the slide. For some arbitral institutions, the female proportion of party appointments decreased over the recorded period. For others, like ICCID, represented by the green line, the proportion of female party appointees has been consistently above average and increased over the period. For others, like the German Arbitration Institute, represented by the brown line, you see transition from below average to above average in the same period. So quite a bit of variability. One possible explanation for this variability between the institutions may be the types of case being administered, whether these are investment cases, commercial cases. The subject matter of the cases may cause variability as well. Another factor might be the effect of repeat appointments. The report does not analyse these these factors in detail, and it might be a source of future research. Repeat appointments would have the effect of reducing diversity because the pool of arbitrators is not in fact expanding, or rather not at the rate the data might otherwise suggest. This chart summarises the trends that I've hopefully explained in the previous slides and sets the stage for our panelist discussion today. It shows the extent to which, on average, institutions, represented in green, co-arbitrators in blue and parties in red, are appointing female arbitrators. Three trends stand out. First, institutions appoint a greater proportion of female arbitrators when compared to co-arbitrators and parties. However, does the data suggest a plateau in the female arbitrator appointments by some institutions? If there has been a plateau, what is the cause of it? Can institutions continue the upward trend that we have seen for some of the institutions participating in the task force? Second, the data also suggests that co-arbitrators may be increasingly inclined to appoint female arbitrators. However, to what extent are these repeat appointments of the same female arbitrator? Also, the proportion of co-arbitrator appointments that are female is still significantly lower than the proportion appointed by institutions. Why is that the case? And what are the opportunities to encourage co-arbitrators to appoint more and new female chairs? Third, the data indicate that parties are least likely to appoint female arbitrators, and that trend hasn't changed much since 2015. Why are parties in council more reluctant to appoint female arbitrators? And what can be done to promote the appointment of more diverse arbitrators by parties? With that, I'll pause and I'll hand over to the other speakers who will discuss these and other related questions in more detail. Thank you.
Be unmuted there. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm absolutely delighted to be here talking about this incredible piece of scholarship on this very, very important issue. I'm going to talk to you today about pipeline leak, which is something that really has worried me since I first began researching the underrepresentation of women, getting on for over 10 years ago now. Appointments of female arbitrators, as including so-called leaks in the pipeline of qualified female candidates. And the report also went on to talk about other barriers, which Carolyn mentioned at the outset, and these included unconscious bias, gender stereotyping, and also information barriers, and that these were additional barriers to obtaining an arbitral appointment as a woman. But I'm going to talk about pipeline today because becoming an arbitrator by definition, you need to be at the top of your profession. And as we all know, it's a very long road to get there. So let's take the good news first. Now, the good news is that we have no shortage of women entering the profession, which is far, far better than STEM subjects, frankly. Science, technology, engineering subjects, you're losing girls at grade school. And at least we're not. As lawyers, we have no shortage of women entering the profession. And you can see some information I've put on the slide for you there. And I've really given you a survey that I referenced in one of my first papers on this subject back in 2010, showing that 65% of law students in the UK at the time were women. Again, at the time, only 20% of partners were women. And then you see a very similar story as we get more recent, more current. And we see a similar story across the US and the UK. you're looking at a significant majority of women entering the profession, but usually around 20-25% of partners being women. And I've given you a nice graphic there on the slide showing that in 2017, the McKinsey study found, looking at US firms, that for every 100 women promoted to partner, only 141 men were promoted. And depressing statistic of the day, not that I want to focus too much on depressing statistics today, but last year, male senior associates were 250% more likely to become partners than their female counterparts, which is a very, very depressing statistic. And I'm sorry to mention that after our very positive statistics that Nicholas shared, but there we are. It is what it is. We suffer as a profession hugely from pipeline leak. So why is that? And as I've been delving into this more, and the report really identifies these issues as well, I have really become aware of how complicated an issue pipeline leak is. And on the slide you'll see there as to why the pipeline leak, this is going to be a very familiar story to you. And the answer to why does the pipeline leak, the answer you always get is that your women's devotion to family makes it possible for them to do the hours that are required, careers suffer. There's really this work-family narrative that you hear time and time again. And I've put a reference there from a Harvard study, 8 years old now, but this was very much the consensus in the respondents to that study. 85% of women responding said it was to do with work-family responsibilities. But increasingly, I'm questioning as to whether that is in fact the case. When I first started looking at this 10 years ago, the response was always flexible working. It was like this magic bullet. Well, here we are 10 years later, and we're still seeing the same problems, even though firms have really done, I think, a huge amount to improve the situation as regards to flexible working. And so the work-family narrative really, it doesn't take into account, frankly, the simple fact that all women are not mothers or carers, but all women struggle to advance. So let's look into this a little bit further and try and see if we can work out why the pipeline really leaks. And as I say, this is an incredibly complicated issue. And I would say, if I had to hazard a response, is to say that the general culture of overwork at law firms affects men and women equally, but women are disproportionately penalised because women are more likely to have taken up those options of flexible working. They're more likely to have accepted these accommodations, and it is those accommodations that then have a negative effect on their career, and that they don't advance the same way as those who've not availed themselves of those accommodations. And when I was preparing for this, I asked my contemporaries, what did they think the reason for pipeline leak was? And you'll see one of the quotes up on the slide there in front of you. And this is really reflecting the stigma that I'm talking about in terms of flexible working. You'll see it there. More often than not, people who work flexibly get paid less for doing the same amount of work or having similar responsibilities. They are not seen as high performers and future leaders. And that's really the key. So I am hopeful, and I'm looking forward to hearing from Tom on this in a few minutes, as to how we work to destigmatize the flexible working options, and how we work to make them more available to men and women, rather than making it disproportionately something that women take up. I've put a couple of push factors there you'll see on the slide. They won't necessarily surprise you. As I say, this work-family narrative encourages women to step down. There's negative perceptions about women. But one thing I found very interesting when, as I say, I was asking my contemporaries as to why they thought women stepped down or even stepped off the career ladder. And I got a very interesting response from somebody, and I want to read it to you if I may, because I think it sums up the more nuanced issue that we're dealing with here. And the response went as follows. A lot of men don't understand that women don't need protection from them. Rather, they need to be given an opportunity to develop and to lead. And often it's the opposite that's happening. The opportunity is lacking, and men feel threatened by women, which makes women leave the profession because they don't fancy spending their energy on these small battles to get the opportunity and credit they deserve. And I thought that response was really absolutely fascinating, because actually it sums up what is often called these microaggressions that minority groups suffer from. And it really reflects the fact that often women just don't want to fight these battles anymore. And so as a result, they leave the profession. And the other factors there I've mentioned on the slide are unconscious bias, perception. Women are often not perceived as competent. There's a Royal Society survey last year of 8,000 participants. The majority said that women were not perceived as competent or as, quote, strong litigators as men, regardless of their qualifications. And these issues are very much explored and developed in the ICCA report, and I really commend the section on pipeline leak to you all. But the ICCA report also very much recognised, and it used the word persistence, the persistence of these barriers, and the fact that they do indicate that gender diversity is not going to be an issue that resolves itself over time. It requires concrete action. So with all that negativity, what can we do about it? And you'll see on the slide in front of you, I've put up some information from a survey. This was a Reuters survey last year, focused on 48 leading law firms that'll be very familiar to you attending the call. And it set out what in their view worked and what didn't work in terms of retaining women. And I will say that the lower performing group is still better than a group with no effort made at all to retain women. But some things did rather jump out at me that may not be immediately evident. It was very interesting, I thought, that women-only networks and formal mentoring programs don't really seem to move the needle when it comes to retention. What does work, seemingly, is ensuring equal representation on both pitches and teams. And that brings me rather neatly to something that is very, very important to arbitration in particular, and that is visibility. And not just visibility within the law firm and external to clients in terms of representation on pitches and in teams, but external visibility. And the report really emphasized this as well. It said that standing out was particularly important for female candidates. And it's very much stressed the importance of attending and speaking at conferences, as we all know. And this is frankly an area that arbitral women have worked incredibly hard at over the years. When I first became aware of arbitral women, it was as a result of them making efforts to ensure a greater representation of female speakers at conferences. But it's also been something that it's been bugging me for a few years. And last year, I finally got round to doing something about this and really taking a hard look, with the great help of a trainee from Freshfields, into the composition of speakers at international arbitration conferences. And between us, we looked at 220 international arbitration conferences that took place in 2019. Seems extraordinary that we were all busy going around the world attending those conferences, but we were. And that data is as an appendix to the report. And unsurprisingly, it's quite sobering reading. I've started the exercise as regards the 2020 data, and I will tell you that it tells a very similar picture. So it's up there on the slide in front of you, and you can see that if you are a man, headline, figure, you are significantly more likely to be invited to speak at a conference than if you are a woman. And what has been interesting in terms of the 2020 data is that there's a dramatic, seemingly, not quite sure why, but a dramatic increase in male keynote speakers as opposed to the previous year. Now, as you'd expect, the 2020 conferences are majority webinars now, and I had hoped that that was going to improve female visibility. It's very early days. We've looked at 109 conferences. What are we now? In early September, so 3/4 of the way through the year. It's not looking like that's going to be a correct assumption at the moment. But as I say, we'll wait and see until we've finished the whole analysis of the year. This is just a second slide showing that you can see that there hasn't been a real change between 2019 and 2020. Apart, as I say, from that fairly significant change in keynote speakers. I would say that the 2019 data I have dug into a little bit more than obviously the 2020 data, and there are some encouraging trends, particularly in terms of the balance of speakers at so-called young events, under 45 events. The speaker roster is much more balanced than across the board. So I think that is very encouraging and something that I hope will carry on as we move through and we see younger generations coming through. So I want to leave you with a very few final thoughts on the issue, and I'm not going to take up any more time because we have so much to get through today and a very interesting discussion to come. But I do just commend you to the report in section 4 of the ICCA report. This goes through some really solid concrete actions that we can all take to address the underrepresentation of women across the board in our field. And the final 2 bullet points are my personal campaign at the moment is to reduce the number that we see of manels. That's all male panels, for those of you who don't know. Or the overrepresentation of men speaking at conferences, and go so far as to invite you to join me in doing our bit by, where we can, refusing to participate in significantly unbalanced speaker rosters. So with that, I will hand back to the next speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lucy. I believe it is now my turn, and I hope that you can hear me. This is Tom Sikora. First, let me thank Carolyn, Lamm, and the other organizers for including me in today's excellent program. I'm truly delighted and indeed honored to be here. I have been an in-house arbitration practitioner at very large energy companies for many years now, and presently serve as the chair of the Corporate Counsel International Arbitration Group. I am thus happy to offer the in-house counsel perspective. There is no doubt that diversity, and specifically gender diversity, in arbitral appointments and in international arbitration overall is an important value. It is important to the system, and it is important to me. Our tribunals should be representative of the society in which they operate. Put another way, ideally, they should look like the world outside the hearing rooms, and half of the world is female. We are terribly far from that goal, and thus promoting gender diversity is both right as a moral imperative, but also right because it strengthens and legitimizes the system. Turning to the client perspective, clients care intensely whether their contractual rights will be protected. That is in very large part why they turn to international arbitration. So to simplify a great deal, whatever strengthens and legitimizes the arbitration system is positive to clients. Conversely, whatever weakens and undermines it is negative. Diversity, including specifically gender diversity, helps to legitimize the system, and in that respect strengthens the system and benefits the clients. When arbitrators do not look like the parties to the dispute, the adverse outcome is immediately attacked as illegitimate. It is assailed as a product of bias that naturally does not need to be complied with. Incidentally, as you can sense, the issue of diversity goes far beyond the issue of gender diversity, the questions of regional diversity and racial and ethnic diversity. Those other imbalances, I dare say, are becoming even more pressing and acute than gender diversity from the perspective of international arbitral legitimacy. Fortunately, gender diversity may actually be easier to address. 25 years ago, when I began my international arbitration practice, almost all of the arbitrators were men. It was a product of an earlier time when female students were actually very rare. Remember that when Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg enrolled at Harvard Law School in the fall of 1956, there were only 9 women in a class of 500 men. She graduated in 1959, so it is hardly surprising that 36 years later, when I began, most of the very senior lawyers and thus senior arbitrators were also men. And contemporaneous female arbitrator appointments, of course, reflected that reality. Only about 2% of arbitrator appointments were women back then. And this is where my generation was starting. Viewed from a historical perspective, we've actually made significant progress. The numbers presented today suggest that the appointment of female arbitrators grew over tenfold to 21% in 2019. And while the institutions are well ahead of party appointments and are skewing the numbers upwards, even party appointments of female arbitrators have risen to about 14%. Viewed from the goal of gender parity, a goal I support, these are, of course, still very depressing numbers. I've heard many times that the role of the client in instructing counsel in promoting gender diversity is really important, and that if only clients got religion on this issue, we could make a lot of progress. There is no doubt some truth to that. Clients are powerful agents for change in the law business. Specifically for arbitrator appointments, what I'm hearing from my in-house colleagues is usually the response, that's not how it works. First of all, clients just really want to win. Put another way, they want to minimize and manage the risk of losing. And in any arbitration, the appointment of arbitrators is a critical element of that strategy. Perhaps no other decisions are equally important as those related to the composition of the tribunal. After all, in arbitration, the quality of decision-making is only as good as the quality of the decision makers. Appointment strategies are hyper-carefully thought out and quite complex. The right appointee often has the desired seniority, subject matter or industry knowledge, legal background, language skills, and desired specific arbitration experience, be it with the legal doctrines, the applicable law, other panel members, or arbitral institutions. This matrix of desired qualities, when actually applied, usually results in a short list of candidates. And then there are the inevitable issues of conflicts and availability, leaving us often with highly limited options. In the end, this is an extremely difficult process, and thus, in practice, it leaves us very little room for diversity goals. To be clear, women candidates are routinely considered these days and often appointed, but they are appointed because, regardless of gender considerations, they are the best available candidate for that appointment. I've also heard the view that when compiling lists of candidates, in-house counsel should insist that their outside counsel teams consider and include female candidates. I suspect that in many cases, it is a very worthwhile and entirely appropriate request. I'll tell you that such a direction to my outside counsel these days would probably elicit the response, why are you assuming we wouldn't consider appropriate female candidates? Well, this response makes a lot more sense when you realize that my outside counsel teams are quite often majority female. This leads me to my final, but in my view, most important point. We do have a burning gender problem, but to solve it by focusing only on the arbitral appointment, we are focusing on the wrong end of the business. To be appointed, it is not enough to be very smart and very qualified. you also have to be experienced and you have to be known. And to become known, you have to be given opportunities and you have to be promoted. When I graduated from law school 25 years ago, over half of my law school class were women. And there were and are plenty of women associates on my outside counsel teams. But something happens to these women associates along the way. Most of them, unfortunately, do not become partners or practice leaders. Somewhere along the way, they are held back or leave. First, current law firm arbitration practice for young lawyers is incredibly intense, and the hours are very long. Succeeding in a modern law firm arbitration practice has become not just a test of brains and skill, but also of brutal physical and mental endurance. It was true in my day, but has only become worse. I feel that we've become too comfortable with what is, too readily accepting a system we've created without stopping to look critically at whether it is right. And in that context, we've actually designed a system that punishes women. Young women who often also want to have a family and need to make a course correction are too often held back, denied opportunities, denied partnership. I have lived through this experience of many of my female friends in our practice. And so women are promoted to leading roles less often than their male counterparts. This, of course, translates into less experience, less visibility, less recognition, all of which translates into fewer opportunities for arbitral appointments. I sense that in the present environment, the fundamental problem lies here. So in my experience, Lucy Greenwood is absolutely right when she talks about a leaky pipeline. We can talk about addressing unconscious bias all we want, but until we address the broken pipeline of new women arbitrators, we will never make meaningful progress towards gender parity. That is the elephant in the room. I'll stop here.
Good morning to all of you. First of all, I would like to thank ICCA and ICSID for the invitation to be part today in the presentation of the report on cross-institutional task force on gender diversity in arbitral appointment proceedings. It's a great honor to be here, and I'm sure this will be a very important report that I hope will influence a big change in order to have many more women appointed as arbitrators. The task that I will have today is to talk about female arbitrator appointments by co-arbitrators. The report confirms that in general, institutions appoint a greater proportion of female arbitrators than parties co-arbitrators. So as you can see from the report, in 2019, the percentage of female arbitrators appointing in average was the following: by institutions 34%, by co-arbitrators 21.5%, and by parties that even worse 13.9%. And why I believe institutions have done a better job. And take, for example, ICC. ICC committed a few years ago to have half of the members of the court being a woman and half of the vice presidents being women. Often, the committees of the court are in charge of making appointments of arbitrators. If you have a vice chairwoman chairing that committee, the possibility that a woman will consider other women to become or to be appointed arbitrators is very important. If you have institutions such as ICSID that has had a Secretary General woman for many years, or the London International Court of Arbitration, who has had women institutional, and they have commitments to appointing women, that's probably the reason for that outcome. The report shows there's a limited data on whether women act as chairman or if they act or they were appointed by co-arbitrators. Co-arbitrators, why does this phenomenon happen? Co-arbitrators tend to nominate typically senior arbitrators with experience acting as chairs of arbitral tribunals. candidates that are known to be diligent and candidates that are efficient. The report addresses these issues as affinity bias and aversion to first-timers. Affinity bias is co-arbitrators often are men who believe that appointing another man equal to them is the right thing to do. And it's an affinity bias which clearly is seen because often the two co-arbitrators that make the appointment are men, and they are likely to appoint another man. And this as well, the aversion to first-timers. Co-arbitrators want to have a chairman that will do a good job in conducting the hearings, that will do a good job in writing procedural orders, and to do a good job in rendering an award which is enforceable. And consequently, arbitrators tend to repeatedly turn to the same candidates, often men they know from other cases where they have appointed in the past, and therefore there's this bias. So next, please. It is increasingly common that arbitration clauses agreed by the parties contemplate that co-arbitrators have to appoint a chairman. Why is that? Often parties more and more prefer that to have a certain control over the process of the appointment of the chairman. If the co-arbitrators have ex parte communication, as often it's agreed by the parties with the co-arbitrators in order to select the potential chairman, they have a certain degree of control of who the chairman is going to be. Parties and if the parties usually prefer having some measure of control over the appointments of the chair, co-arbitrators play an essential role in this process, and obviously proposing women to the parties. And if we go to a list system, in the list system, co-arbitrators probably prepare a list, let's say, of 5 arbitrators, each co-arbitrator. And if women are included, the possibility of having appointments of women will greatly increase. If you have the strike system, rank and strike, if you have, let's say, half women in the list, the possibility that the woman will be appointed increases very importantly. There are a lot of qualified women, and particularly among the more senior women, they are appointed frequently. They are very frequent appointment of those women, and we see them very often. But there's a very important group of younger women in their 40s that have participated in law firms for many years, that have worked probably 20, 25 years in law firms as counsel or even assisting more senior arbitrators in their arbitrations, a secretary, for example, of the tribunal. And there are many, many candidates that are very reliable, that are very good. And I think that something which is very important is the pledge for arbitration. Next, please. The pledge, to me, in my personal experience, made a big difference. About 3 years ago, when I was in an international arbitration conference, I was approached in order to sign the pledge. I was informed of what the pledge was, and it made a very important influence in my career. Since those 3 years ago that I signed the pledge, there have been about 7 women that my firm has appointed in arbitrations where we act as counsel. As well, I have included women in the list when I act as co-arbitrator, where I have had the possibility of influence the appointment of women. And I believe that, as Lucy Reed has said, if you prepare a list of potential arbitrators, to take those 5 minutes and think about women are capable for doing the job and try to include them in those lists. And in my personal experience, this made a difference, and I think this is a path going forward for everybody. So I invite everybody that has not done so, sign the pledge, and this will certainly help in that process. Thank you very much.
I will try and move quickly so we have a little bit more time to discuss some of the very good questions that have come through. So as we've noted several times here, I'm going to deal with the institutional perspective, and that is a good news story. About 1/3 of all institutional appointments have been female, and institutions have truly led the way. And I think this is true as well at ICSID, where our numbers show quite a few females being appointed, especially when you compare it to appointments by other sectors, in other words, counsel or co-arbitrators. Now, I think one of the interesting things about this number of females that have been appointed, and especially in the early days, is that it masks one phenomenon, which is that often we have the same females being appointed. And so I think there is much more diversity now and much more breadth of the group of females who are starting to be appointed. But not only in the beginning did you have few in terms of pure numbers, but they were often the same females appointed several times over. And so there was an element of repeat appointment there as well. And I think that's certainly less the case today. We also appoint fewer in terms of broad numbers than other parts of the whole process. So when I look at it, the ICSID chairman and secretary general really only get to appoint about 25 to 30% of the time. And what this really tells you is that even if we appointed all females, we would not affect the overall numbers to a point where you've got near parity. And it really goes back to this whole issue of a debate: whose responsibility is it? Is it parties? Is it co-arbitrators? Is it institutions? And I don't think there's any answer other than the fact that if all of us don't pull our weight in terms of that, we won't get near to where we want to be. So it's a little bit of a pointless debate to say whose responsibility is it, because it truly is all of our responsibility to do this and to be aware of it. I wanted to just look at some of the ways ICSID has approached this and what has helped us increase the numbers in the last little while. And I think there are a couple of practices that we have adopted that have been very, very helpful and instrumental in keeping the numbers on the rise. Number one is accountability. Basically that you publish the data, and so you are accountable, and more important than that, the general audience is aware and knows the extent to which females are being appointed. I think that's really important, and we do so in our stats reports, our newsletters, etc. It brings awareness and it brings accountability. The second thing, and I think this is perhaps the most important thing that we have done, is that we have started to use what we called ballots much more often, and we've made parties aware that we will use lists. And ballots and lists are fairly similar, except that a ballot is, for example, 5 people, and the parties have to agree on one of them. And if they don't, we go straight to our ICSID panel. A list is different in that you will always get an appointee out of a list. So again, perhaps 5 people, but parties will rank them in number order, and the most preferred arbitrator as between the 2 parties will be selected. But what's important about ballots and lists here, obviously, is that you have an opportunity to put female names forward. And I should add here, not just female, we're also very concerned about regional representation and something that we call first timers, getting new people onto panels and onto the tribunals. But ballots and lists give you an opportunity to put those names forward. So for example, in the gender context, we always have at least one and usually more females on a 5-person list. And just to give you the idea, from last year, we had 25 ballots. 1 had no female candidates. 1 female candidate was on 6 of those ballots, 2 female candidates on 13, and 3 female candidates on 5 of those ballots. So really trying to get female names out. The important thing to remember here is that out of those 25 ballots, only 1 ballot had a successful female candidate. So there's 2 moving parts to this. Number 1 is to put female names on the ballots or on the lists, but number 2, to hope that they are selected off the list. And that's something I think that's an important thing to think about. We've got similar statistics with our lists. Last year we did 18 lists. Of those, 5 had 1 female candidate, 5 had 2 female candidates, 7 had 3 female candidates, and 1 had 4 of the 5 as female candidates. And in our lists, there were 3 successful appointments of female candidates from these 18 lists. So obviously still getting people picked off the list is a challenge and is important, but I do note something that I had not expected, which is often somebody's name will be on a ballot or on a list, and they might not be selected by the parties. But interestingly, it still serves an important function because it basically puts that name out for consideration. And I've seen a number of times where ICSID will propose somebody 1, 2, or 3 times and they don't get selected. And then that name comes back as a party appointee. So even when people aren't selected, it performs an important function of saying, here are some of the people who could be selected. Another area where I think we need improvement, and we have talked to our states, are in terms of their nominations to panels. 19% of the ICSID panels are female, and we have made a very big effort to talk to our state representatives. We have written our state representatives, and we have asked them to keep diversity in mind. The final area has been where we ourselves are able to pick people to our panels, and that's through the chair's list, which is 10 arbitrators and 10 conciliators. And the last time that was done was 2017, because it's a 6-year term, and the chair appointed 50% female arbitrators and 50% female conciliators. So important to walk the talk, and that's what we've tried to do in that chair's list. The final piece is something that Lucy spoke about, and that is opportunities for visibility. That is very key, just to have opportunities to show that you are very capable and someone parties could trust to nominate. And that comes in a lot of things like conferences, writing in the ICSID review, being part of webinars. All of those are important opportunities, and we've tried to make a real point of making sure that we have very close to equal representation on those panels. So that's a little bit about the kinds of practices that we've been doing at ICSID, and that I know a number of our other arbitral institution colleagues have been working on, and I think they all help move the ball forward. So I'll pass it back to Carolyn at this point, and we can also get to questions in a few minutes. There have been a few wonderful questions.
Thank you so much. Fabulous contributions by all. And from these presentations, you can clearly see the diversity of views represented on the task force between arbitrators, advocates, institutions, etc., that we truly work to reconcile. I guess I would say, in distilling it down from my perspective going forward, the selection of arbitrators is incredibly complex when your client's issues and future may be on the line. Whether it's financial or political or what the motivating factors are, it takes a great deal of sensitivity. So I think the most important thing is to really assure an adequate pipeline of women arbitrators who have the experience and have demonstrated the capacity. And that comes, I think, from supporting things like Young ICCA, the Young Arbitrators Association, opening the doors to give women experience in law firms, but also assuring that they perform with excellence when you open those doors. It is, again, not like turning on a light switch. You work with them to make sure their crosses are going to be perfect, to make sure their arguments are going to be perfect, and make sure their client contacts are excellent. So you promote young women and others who need experience and visibility. I think each of us has a distilled comment. I think Nicola has one.
Thank you, Carolyn. Yes, my concrete suggestion, which ties together with my presentation, is, in summary, more data. And I think there are two aspects to this. And I would start by noting a point that Carolyn made at the beginning of her presentation, which is it is difficult for institutions to be collating and recording a lot of this data. But it is very important, and it has been extremely useful for the task force. So to the extent we can record more data, I think that would be very beneficial. So first of all, more institutions recording and publishing information, and we hope that other institutions will be inspired by the task force either to get involved or on the record to record and publish data that the task force can use. And this is information about the gender of arbitrators appointed by not just the institution, but also co-chairs and parties. And the sort of second aspect of this is that it would be fantastic to record additional diversity criteria. Here we would have information about repeat appointments, about the appointment of first-timers, potentially the type of case, the role of the arbitrator, whether it's a chair, an emergency arbitrator, and intersectional factors like race and ethnicity. And tracking and publishing this information will certainly advance our understanding of the causes of lack of diversity, but also, I think, the opportunities to increase diversity and move forward. I'll hand over to the next speaker.
Maybe if we just want to quickly go around with tips. Lucy, have you got a one-liner tip here?
So before I'm going to say it again, no more manuals, no more manuals. Let's call them out. Seriously, I see them all the time because I know I'm highly sensitized to them. But let's all work to ensure that our certainly up and coming, as Carolyn says, young female arbitration practitioners get the visibility that they deserve. So please, yes, call it out, no more manuals.
Tom, what's your one-liner tip?
My one-liner would be that flexible working arrangements at law firms should not be viewed as demerits for female associates, and female associates should be supported and promoted regardless of the flexible working arrangements they may choose.
And Klaus, have you got a one-liner tip here?
Yes, I think that the partners in law firms, the senior partners, involve women. I have a case now I'm trying as a counsel with 4 women, only women team. And I have to say, it has been the best experience I've had in my career. They work very well. They are very efficient, and I'm absolutely delighted. And I recommend to senior partners and firms to do that, to make it only women groups and try cases very effectively. Thank you.
Fantastic. Mine is a one word, it's visibility. Visibility so you can show your competence, because that's the key. We have had a number of very good questions, and I wanted to just move us quickly to a few of those questions. One of the big ones that came back to the issue of pipeline leakage and law firm culture is a number of people have written saying that they've experienced and that they see this, but the real problem is, how do you get this to change? That is really the difficult part. And I wonder if anybody has thoughts on concrete things that can make law firm practice change, or is that just a function of law firm economics? How do we get to move that needle? Tom or Lucy, you may have a thought on that.
So this is Tom. I've always suggested to my outside counsel that there's something wrong with the structure when I sit with my outside counsel when I travel, and I'm still there at midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning in their office, and everyone else is still there. They're not staffing the cases appropriately. If that level of commitment and effort is necessary, I think we should all, as clients, try to speak up when we see that, because if there's sufficient client pressure to let our young lawyers go home at a more reasonable hour, I think law firms will listen.
Anyone else on that?
Yeah, I mean, if I can just add on that, law firms have been trying to address this issue, and that is fundamentally because it is an economic issue. Law firms spend an awful lot of money training young associates, and if you're going to lose half your cohort before a certain amount of time, you're losing money out of it. So it is very important to frame this as an economic issue. What I have found very interesting, and this is why I brought this out in my presentation, is what works and what doesn't work. And what works are far more subtle and far more challenging than what doesn't work. So training women doesn't work because it only reinforces the gender stereotype that women need training to be better leaders, which is not true at all. But it's very well-meaning. We'll send all our women on leadership courses. It doesn't work in terms of retaining women. What women need, as I mentioned, is to move away from this culture of the negative perception. It's very, very easy to say, very difficult to do. But you move away from that by operating a truly inclusive culture. And that's back to being critical when we look around the room and we say, who is in the room? And more importantly, who is speaking in the room? And ensuring that when we are in a room, that we act in a very inclusive way and we ensure that everyone's voice is heard, whoever they are. And that's, I think, something that historically we haven't done well as lawyers. So it is an incredibly complicated issue, and it's one I have not addressed. The report rightly says, and I strongly believe this, that there are additional hurdles to women being appointed as arbitrators once you get to the end of the pipeline. But Tom is absolutely right. We need to make sure that the pipeline is flowing better, and then we have a chance of affecting the end statistics more significantly than we have done so far. And we have really affected them in the last 10 years, as Nicola's presentation showed. But we can do more and do better.
In a bit of a related question, somebody has asked whether the fact that women are not as often arbitrators reflects all the way through the career, that, for example, they're not partners, they're not in senior positions in law firms, they're not first chairs in litigation. And then a sub-question to that, which is it up to women to try to mentor younger women to make sure that they get into those roles? Are there any thoughts on that? Carolyn or Klaus?
I agree in part. I mean, women, and if you look at the White and Case International Arbitration Group, for instance, we've always promoted and mentored women. We have at the leadership, Abby Cohen-Smutney, myself, Andrea Menaker, Kristen Young, Ank Stanton, so many women, and it's because the women there help the other women. And I think that is something that, you promote excellence in terms of performance for clients. We could address, but I don't want to address on an anecdotal basis some of the comments about how to integrate this into the law firm economic model. It could be an entire course on that. And it would take people with true knowledge of how you do that, how comp works, how revenue works, how expense works, how teams work. But putting that aside and focusing on what the report did address, I think there is enough there in terms of mentoring women I disagree that it doesn't help. It does help in terms of opening doors for women with clients, with seats at the table, whether it's in meetings or in presentations at an arbitral hearing. All of that's important. And it really takes a sustained effort.
And I agree with Caroline that the perfect example is Whiting Case, because they really do it. The problem is it's an exception, unfortunately. I would love to see more firms doing that. And therefore, I think men have to take an important role, because in those firms where you don't have that many women, it's men that need to push forward to incorporate women in the teams, to make them have an important role in hearings, and to, of course, promote your younger partners, women partners, to take roles as arbitrators. It's very small cases. And I always say, let's start with a very small case of $1 million or $100,000. It doesn't matter. And it doesn't matter if the firm, it's not going to be productive for the firm. It's important that they have the experience. Because the first appointment is a difficult one for everybody, for men, for women, and for diversity. So I think that it's the small cases where one has to really try to push diversity, whether it's women, whether it's regional, and I think that's where we have. But I think if men do not support the system, it will not work. And therefore, as I mentioned earlier, the example of ICC, where I said we'll have 50% women on the court. And when I was the governing body of the ICC court, we said only 50% have to be women, and half of the vice president have to be women. And I'm absolutely convinced that helped tremendously. That was a big step forward. And therefore, if men do not support it, things will not change drastically. So I think we have to convince as well men. Of course, women have to be involved, but I think men have to be part of the movement.
We've run out of time, so if I can, I'll just ask one further question. One observer noted that there were no African institutions in the statistics, and the related question is, have we seen any correlations between your legal tradition or between your cultural or regional affiliations, and how does that play out onto gender? Nicola, I don't know if you saw any of those kinds of things statistically, and others, if you have any ideas on that.
Thanks, Meg. The short answer is that we weren't able to track that kind of data. The number of institutions that were participating is limited regionally to the US, Europe, Hong Kong. But that's not to say it needs to stay that way. And I know that the task force is very keen to involve other institutions. And as the task force membership grows, I hope it will be possible to track this kind of regional correlation, whether that's from the African continent, more of Asia, law firm cultures. And as I mentioned, another criterion that will be very interesting to investigate further is the type of case being involving women, whether it's the Court of Arbitration for Sport is an example, but there are other institutions that deal with particular types of arbitration that it would be very interesting to have them involved and see the data that they're collecting. So in summary, unfortunately, not this time, but certainly something to do in the future, and I hope that we get there.
But does anyone else see any observations or correlation between gender and legal tradition or cultural tradition?
I think certainly this is anecdotal evidence. In those legal cultures or professions where you have a predominant number of women making up the profession, many in Eastern Europe, maybe in the Philippines, etc., you will find that, in fact, there are more women serving as arbitrators, necessarily and of course. And we at the task force would welcome the participation of more of the African, more of the Central European etc. I think it adds a different dimension to the debate, but we need to do it on the basis of statistics.
Good. And Carolyn, I think last word for you, simply to close up.
Just to say thank you tremendously to all of the institutions who did contribute their time, their effort, their data. We could not have done it without them. And, we made the greatest effort to be balanced and to hear from as many as we could. We welcome more, but to even reconcile the views of all of those participating takes a fairly significant effort. And the important thing is, I think what we did was to stick to the data and the evidence and try to make observations from that. So going forward, I do hope we have others. But I think we need to stay close to the data and to the literature. There is a lot of literature in the area. And we hope we'll be looking at a few different issues as well. But thank you, Meg, for all of your support at ICCA, and Klaus as well. And of course, to Nicola for her extraordinary effort in synthesizing all the data.
Good. And thank you to everybody who's joined us this morning. Have a good rest of your day.